I watched her raise her glass, the light from the chandelier catching the rim like a flash of gold, and heard her say the words as if they were a blessing. "To our new home, and to our honored guest, Margaret." Laughter rippled through the room. I smiled, small, polite, the kind of smile you wear when everyone's watching. But inside, the words slid into me like a splinter. Guest. Not mother, not family, not the woman who'd paid for the walls holding us in. The kitchen smelled of rosemary and roasted chicken, but under it all was something sharper. That faint metallic tang of being dismissed without a single raised voice. Around me, the women from Claire's book club clinked glasses and adjusted their pearls. The men in the corner laughed over stories I wasn't part of. David, my son, stood beside his wife, his hand resting on her back, his smile steady. He didn't flinch at her choice of words. The chandelier above us glittered like it had something to celebrate. My seat was near the end of the long farmhouse table. Not quite the head, not quite the middle, just far enough away that when Claire's eyes swept the room, they could skim right over me without landing. My fingers curled around the stem of my glass, the condensation dampening my palm. I'd been in this house for 6 months, and yet in that moment I felt like I'd just arrived, suitcase still by the door. Someone refilled my wine without asking. I murmured a thank you. It floated away, unheard. Claire was radiant that night. She'd chosen a silk blouse the color of champagne, soft hair falling in loose waves over her shoulders. She had that way of moving through her own home as if the furniture bent toward her. I watched her hands as she spoke, one holding her glass, the other sweeping in a graceful arc to indicate the newly painted walls, the refinished floors, the art she'd picked herself. "This place finally feels like ours," she said, and the word ours landed heavier than the wine in my glass. The chatter rose again, chairs scraping softly against the polished wood floor. I caught fragments of conversations. Vacations, remodeling tips, whose kid got into which college. None of it touched me. From my seat, I could see the front windows. Beyond the glass, the porch light spilled across the driveway where I'd stood with the movers months ago, directing boxes into what I thought was my space, my own suite, my own corner of this dream home. Back then, the air smelled like fresh paint and promise. Claire's laugh cut through the clinking silverware, bright and warm, but when her eyes passed over me, it was like a curtain falling. "You'll have to forgive Margaret," she told a woman across the table. "She's still getting used to being in a bigger place." I set my fork down gently. The chicken was tender, the potatoes buttery, but each bite had begun to taste like paper. The conversation around me blurred. I looked at my son. David's jaw was tense, not from discomfort, but from chewing too slowly, as if he were buying time before saying anything that might cause a ripple. He didn't meet my eyes. It wasn't the first time she'd drawn a line in the air between them and me, but this time the line was bolder, public, permanent. I leaned back in my chair, letting the noise wash over me and let my gaze travel across the dining room. On the far wall, above the buffet table, hung the housewarming gift I'd given them, a framed watercolor of their new home. The artist had captured the curve of the front porch perfectly. I wondered if anyone else noticed the small detail I'd asked for, the faint outline of 2 names etched into the lower left corner, mine and David's, the way they appeared on the deed. Probably not. No one here seemed to notice much. Claire tapped her glass with the tip of her knife. "Before we move on to dessert, I just want to say how grateful we are to everyone who helped make this dream a reality. You've all been so supportive. And Margaret..." She turned to me, that same smile, wide, polished, empty. "Thank you for joining us tonight." Joining us. I could feel the eyes of the table on me, waiting for some gracious response. I gave them the smallest nod I could manage without being called rude. The moment passed. The plates were cleared. The hum of conversation swelled again. But I stayed still, watching the way the candlelight flickered across the stem of my glass, watching the way Claire's hand rested so easily on David's arm, as if it had always belonged there. The word guest kept turning over in my mind, quiet but relentless. When the laughter rose again, I let my eyes drift toward the hallway leading to the small locked trunk at the foot of my bed, the one with the sealed folder inside, the one I hadn't opened in over a year. I took a slow sip of wine and decided that when the night ended, I was going to open it. When the last of Claire's friends drifted out into the cool night air, balancing foil-covered dessert plates and murmuring polite goodbyes, I stayed in my chair a moment longer. The clink of wine glasses in the sink, the shuffle of Claire's heels across the tile, all of it carried a rhythm I'd learned by heart in the months since I'd moved in. 6 months ago, I'd been in a very different rhythm. A quiet, one-bedroom apartment just outside of town, a grocery list that fit on a single sticky note, my mornings filled with black coffee and the crossword. I was never rich, but after decades as a librarian and a lifetime of living within my means, I was steady, careful. My late husband, Henry, used to call it keeping the train on the tracks. Then came the fall. One uneven curb, a snap in my hip like a twig breaking underfoot, and the recovery that followed. David had shown up at the hospital with Claire in tow, both of them all smiles and certainty. "Mom, you can't go back to that apartment. It's too much on your own," David had said. Claire chimed in, her voice soft but firm. "We've got the space. Stay with us until you're back on your feet." At the time, I'd thought it was kindness. Their old house was a snug split level, so when they started talking about upgrading to something bigger, "With a downstairs suite for you, Mom," I didn't hesitate. I wrote a check for the down payment, enough to turn their dream into an offer no seller could refuse. It wasn't framed as a loan, and it wasn't meant to be charity. It was family. My condition was simple: a small suite on the ground floor, my own space, my own bathroom, so I wouldn't have to climb stairs. "Of course," Claire had said, her smile as warm as the coffee she poured. "It'll be your little haven." I didn't ask for my name on the deed. I already knew it would be there. Martin, my friend from church who practiced real estate law, had handled the paperwork. He'd slipped me a copy at the signing, sealed in a manila folder. "Joint tenancy," he'd said quietly, "with right of survivorship, just in case." I hadn't opened it since. The new house had been a blank canvas when we moved in. Fresh paint, bare walls, the faint scent of sawdust still lingering in the air. My suite was painted a pale green. I'd chosen myself, a color that reminded me of the hydrangeas Henry used to plant along our fence. At first, it felt like a retreat. I unpacked my books onto built-in shelves, set my old oak desk under the window, and thought I'd found a peaceful corner for my next chapter. But houses have a way of showing their true character, and so do people. Claire was beautiful in that effortless catalog way, with a knack for arranging flowers so they looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. She was also quick with a compliment that had an edge if you turned it over. "You're so lucky, Margaret," she told me once, over morning coffee, "to not have to worry about bills anymore." I wanted to tell her I'd been paying bills since she was in diapers, but instead I smiled and said nothing. I started to notice little things. My mail would be tucked on the kitchen counter, opened before I saw it. A sweater I'd left folded on the arm of my chair turned up washed and shrunken in the laundry room. The framed wedding photo of me and Henry, which had always sat on my desk, appeared one day on a high shelf in the hall. "It just looks better there," Claire explained, her tone light. Sunday dinners, once a tradition when David was a boy, shifted in tone. Claire set the menu, the table, and the conversation. My stories were politely received, then gently redirected. "That's lovely, Margaret," she'd say, before asking someone else about their weekend trip to the coast. David had always been even-tempered, conflict-averse. As a child, he'd slip away from arguments between friends rather than take a side. Now, as a husband, he let Claire set the current, and he floated along behind her. If he noticed the way she began introducing me, "David's mom, she's staying with us for a while," he didn't say so. I told myself it was temporary, that once my hip was strong again, I'd feel more like myself. But even as I regained my stride, I felt a different sort of limp setting in. And there were bright spots, of course, the quiet mornings before anyone else was up, when I'd sip tea at my desk and watch the sun climb over the back fence, the small satisfaction of keeping my hydrangeas alive in their pots on the patio, a little patch of color no one else bothered with. And there were moments with David, short, rare, when he'd linger in my doorway, coffee in hand, and ask about a book I was reading. But the balance was shifting. One afternoon in late spring, I came home from a short walk to find 2 cardboard boxes on the garage floor, my handwriting on the labels, winter scarves and photo albums. My closet shelves looked bare. Claire was in the kitchen, humming as she stirred something on the stove. "Oh, I thought I'd make some space in your room," she said when I asked. "You've got so many things in there, and we'll need room for the new linens." It was said so casually, as if my belongings were clutter, not history. Later that week, while planting fresh flowers in the front yard, our neighbor June, the type who knows everything before anyone else does, leaned over the hedge. "Claire must be thrilled with that house," she said. "She told me at the HOA meeting last week how proud she is to finally have a place of her own." June smiled. "She's a go-getter, that one." I smiled back, but something in me bristled. Then came the party. The housewarming Claire had been planning for weeks. She baked pies from scratch, polished the silver, and arranged the seating chart with the precision of a wedding planner. The guest list included her friends from the club, neighbors, even the realtor who'd sold us the house. I was placed at the far end of the table, introduced, thanked, toasted, and labeled the guest. When the last wine glass was dried and put away, I carried my plate to the sink and turned to see Claire at the counter, scrolling through her phone. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Oh, Margaret," she said lightly, "don't forget to clear your things out of the guest room before Saturday." "The guest room?" I asked, keeping my tone even. She smiled, just a flicker. "We're turning it into a home office. You've got the suite downstairs, remember?" Her voice was smooth, her eyes steady. I nodded, but something shifted in my chest, a small click, like a lock sliding into place. Because the truth was, I did remember. I remembered every agreement we'd made, every check I'd written, every signature on every page. And I remembered the sealed folder in the trunk at the foot of my bed. It started small enough that, if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have convinced myself I imagined it. A week after the housewarming, I came back from my morning walk to find the small stack of mail I'd left on my desk. Gone. I checked the kitchen counter, the hall table. Nothing. Claire was in the breakfast nook, laptop open, coffee in hand. "Your mail?" she said when I asked. "Oh, I sorted it for you. Just a few things from the bank. I put them in our filing cabinet so the kitchen stays tidy." Our filing cabinet. That night, I slipped into the study after they'd gone to bed. In the cabinet drawer, there were my envelopes, slid open, papers neatly clipped together, each stamped with my name in the corner. My checking account statement sat on top, paperless by my request until now. I slid it back into the envelope and carried it to my room without a word. It should have been nothing. Paper. Numbers. But it left me with the uneasy sense that my life was no longer entirely mine. A few days later, I went looking for my grandmother's quilt, the one I kept folded at the foot of my bed. It wasn't there. I found it, freshly laundered and crammed into a storage bin in the garage, squeezed between a box of holiday lights and a set of old tennis rackets. Claire was wiping down the counters when I came back inside. "Oh, that old thing?" she said. "I thought it might get dusty in your room. Better to store it." I didn't trust my voice enough to answer. These weren't accidents. They were small, quiet rearrangements. A book moved from my shelf to the upstairs loft. A potted plant shifted to the corner of the patio where I couldn't see it from my chair. It was as if my presence was being reduced to something temporary, a placeholder in my own home. Sunday dinners became the worst. Once they had been the center of our family life. Roast chicken, green beans with almonds, Henry pouring me a glass of wine while David told us about his week. Now Claire decided the menu, the guest list, the conversation. One evening, halfway through a plate of lemon pasta, Claire gestured toward me with her fork. "You should come to the garden club meeting next week, Margaret. We could use someone with extra time on their hands." I heard the subtle note in it. "You don't do much, do you?" And smiled politely. "I'll think about it." David didn't look up from his plate. It was like that often, a comment that seemed harmless to anyone else, but landed on me like a pebble dropped in water. Small, but enough to ripple. "You're lucky you can sleep in," when I didn't join them for breakfast. "Don't worry about the grocery bill, we've got it covered." When I came back from the market with a bag of food I'd paid for myself. Even the neighbors began to echo her narrative. June from next door, with her knowing eyes, said to me over the fence, "Claire's been talking about converting that downstairs suite into a workout space. You must be thinking about moving soon." I smiled in that tight-lipped way that says everything and nothing at once. The real blow came on a Tuesday morning. I was in the kitchen pouring tea when Claire breezed in, hair still damp from the shower, smelling faintly of rose shampoo. "By the way," she said casually, pulling a mug from the cupboard, "we'll be having some work done in your suite next month. Just new flooring, but it'll mean you'll have to stay upstairs for a few weeks." "My suite?" I asked, the words sticking in my throat. She nodded, sipping her coffee. "We want to match it to the rest of the house, make it more cohesive." "Is David on board with this?" I asked. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "David trusts me to handle these things." It wasn't the flooring, it was the way she said "your suite" like it was already slipping from my hands. That afternoon I went into the garage to look for the storage bin with my quilt again. It wasn't there. I checked the shelves, the rafters, even behind the mower. Gone. The next day, the bin reappeared, but this time it was labeled in black marker. Margaret Storage. That single dash between my name and the word storage lodged itself in me. The turning point, though, came during one of Claire's little gatherings, a casual wine and cheese with the ladies from her book club. I was in the living room setting a plate of crackers on the coffee table when I heard her voice from the kitchen. "Well, it's really our house," she was saying. "Margaret's just staying until she's ready to, find something smaller. She's comfortable here, but it's not really her place." A soft laugh followed, someone murmuring, "That must be tricky." "It's fine," Claire said. "We're patient." I set the plate down slowly, my hands steady even as my chest tightened. It was the word patient. The implication that my presence was a burden to be endured until it was over. After that night, the air between us was different. She was polite, always polite. But there was a practiced quality to it now, as though she were managing me like an overdue task. David kept his head down, eyes fixed on his phone when the air got heavy. Then came the HOA barbecue. It was the kind of afternoon you see in neighborhood brochures, checkered tablecloths, kids chasing each other across the lawn, the smell of burgers on the grill. I'd brought my potato salad, the same one people had been asking for since Henry and I first moved to town. Claire flitted between groups, glass of lemonade in hand, introducing herself like the mayor of the cul-de-sac. I stood near the buffet, chatting with June, when Claire's voice rang out from the shade of the pergola. "This is our house," she told a man I didn't recognize. "We just love it. Margaret's been staying with us while she figures out her next step." The man looked at me, smiling as if to say, "Oh, I see." I smiled back, the kind that hurts your cheeks. "She's been such a help," Claire added, "but we want to get that downstairs space ready for when we need it. Maybe a nursery one day." The words hung in the air like smoke. I excused myself. stepping back toward the edge of the lawn, my plate of salad untouched. From where I stood, I could see the house, the wide porch, the fresh paint, the hydrangeas blooming just to the left of the front steps. And behind those walls, in a locked trunk at the foot of my bed, was the truth, my name, in ink, on the deed. June's voice floated to me from the table. "She's got plans, that one," she said. I didn't answer. Because in that moment, under the bright blue sky and the scent of burgers in the air, I knew something for certain. Claire wasn't just making space for her plans, she was making sure there was no space for me. And she was doing it in public. That night after the HOA barbecue, I lay in bed staring at the faint reflection of my lamp in the window. The laughter from earlier still rang in my ears, Claire's light, airy voice calling me temporary, in transition, like I was a visitor passing through my own life. I rolled to my side and looked at the trunk at the foot of my bed. The brass latch glinted in the lamplight, and for the first time in months, I didn't just see an old piece of furniture, I saw a key. I sat up, my hip protesting as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. The trunk creaked when I opened it, the smell of cedar rising up. There, beneath a stack of winter sweaters, was the sealed manila folder Martin had given me the day we closed on the house. The glue on the flap gave way with a quiet tear. Inside, the deed. David Hollis and Margaret Hollis, co-owners, joint tenants with right of survivorship. Not a word about Claire, not one. And beneath the deed, stapled to the back, a clause I'd forgotten about. This property cannot be refinanced, sold, or materially altered without the written consent of both owners. My signature, David's signature, the ink still as black as the day it dried. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the paper solid in my hands. I'd spent months letting Claire rearrange me like furniture, all the while holding the one thing she could never touch. The next morning, I called Martin. "Margaret," he said, his voice warm. "Been wondering when I'd hear from you." I told him everything, the mail, the storage bins, the guest introductions, the barbecue. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he sighed. "So, you're ready to protect yourself?" "Yes," I said. "Then here's what we do. You create a living trust for your share of the property, with a beneficiary you choose. That way, your half can't be meddled with. And if you want, we can trigger a partition valuation." Partition valuation? It's a formal assessment, he explained. We have the property measured, appraised, and documented. A step toward splitting or selling if you choose. It sends a message. I pictured Claire's face if an assessor showed up with a clipboard. "Let's do it," I said. We met that afternoon in his office. The smell of old paper and lemon polish wrapped around me like a memory of the library I once ran. Martin spread the deed out on his desk and slid a trust form beside it. "Who's the beneficiary?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. "Evan, my grandson. David's son from his first marriage." Claire barely acknowledged the boy. He lived with his mother across town. Martin nodded, his pen scratching across the page. "Good choice. And you'll be trustee, sole control, no co-signers." I signed, the pen steady in my hand. "Now," he said, "about the valuation. I'll have an assessor at the house next week. Claire doesn't need to be warned." I smiled for the first time in days. "No," I said, "she really doesn't." The day came bright and unassuming, a Wednesday. Claire was hosting her social club brunch. Fresh flowers on the table, scones cooling on the rack. I slipped out early, telling her I had errands. By mid-morning, Martin arrived with the assessor, a tall woman named Carla, who wore her tape measure clipped to her belt like a badge. They rang the bell. Claire answered, confusion flickering across her face. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Carla said smoothly. "We're here to measure the property for valuation. It'll take about an hour." Claire's smile froze. "I'm sorry. There must be a mistake. My husband didn't. I authorized it." The sound of my voice from behind the doorway made her turn sharply. I stepped inside. the sunlight from the open door catching the edges of the trust folder in my hands. Her eyes narrowed. "What is this?" I moved past her into the living room, every step deliberate. "This," I said, "is a property valuation. And this—" I held up the letter Martin had prepared, stamped and notarized, "is notice that my share of this home is now in a protected trust. Effective immediately, you are barred from making changes without my written consent." Gasps came from the dining room where her friends had gathered. Someone's coffee cup clinked too hard against its saucer. Claire's voice was low, tight. "You can't just—" "I can," I said, meeting her eyes, "and I already have." The assessor walked past us, her clipboard ready, beginning measurements of the front hall. The sound of her tape snapping back into place echoed in the silence. Claire followed me into the living room. "This is our house," she hissed. I turned to face her fully. "No, Claire, this is my house and David's house. Your name isn't on a single page of this deed." Her cheeks flushed. "David will never let you—" "David signed the same papers I did," I cut in, "and he knew exactly what they meant." She glanced toward the kitchen, perhaps hoping for backup, but the women there were staring studiously at their plates. No one wanted to be part of this scene. "You've been planning this," she said, her voice rising. I let a small smile touch my lips. "Yes, ever since you started calling me a guest." For a moment, we stood like that, the room holding its breath. Then the assessor reappeared, asking to measure the dining room. Claire stepped aside stiffly. I didn't linger. I walked to my suite, retrieved the last box of personal files I'd kept, and carried it toward the door. Claire followed me halfway, but stopped short when Martin appeared, holding the trust documents like a shield. "Mrs. Hollis has made her position clear," he said evenly. I stepped out onto the porch, the summer air warm against my face. I didn't look back. I didn't go far. Just to the coffee shop on the corner where I sat, by the window and watched the street. My phone buzzed 3 times in quick succession. "Claire!" I let them go to voicemail. The 4th buzz was a text from Martin. "All done. She's rattled. Carla will send the report by tomorrow." I typed back, "Good." There's a certain kind of silence that follows a move like that, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of someone recalculating. I knew Claire. She would rage, then regroup, then look for another way in. But now, the door was locked, and I held the only key. That night, I returned home just as the sun was setting, painting the walls gold. Claire was nowhere in sight. David was in the backyard trimming the hedge. He looked up, his face unreadable. "Mom," he said simply. "David," I replied. We stood there a moment, the hum of the trimmer fading. "You blindsided her," he said finally. "I protected myself," I answered. He didn't argue. He just nodded once and went back to the hedge. Later, in my room, I placed the trust folder in the top drawer of my desk, where it would be easy to reach. I poured myself a glass of iced tea and sat by the window, looking out at the hydrangeas in bloom. For months, I'd been shrinking to fit inside the space Claire allowed me. Tonight, the walls had moved, and in the quiet, I could almost hear Henry's voice, steady, certain, reminding me of something he'd said years ago. "The moment you stop asking for your place is the moment you claim it." I'd claimed it. The next step, making sure she knew I wasn't giving it back. Worse, the morning after the valuation, the house felt different. Not in the way a room feels after you've moved furniture. More like the air itself had shifted. I could hear Claire in the kitchen, moving cups around, the clink of porcelain sharper than usual. She didn't look up when I walked in. "Coffee's fresh," she said, her tone clipped. "Tea for me, thanks." I filled the kettle and set it on the stove. The whistle would come soon enough. David came in a few minutes later, hair damp from his shower, his eyes darting between us like a man trying to read a weather report. "Morning," he said. I answered with a quiet, "Morning." But Claire didn't. She busied herself with the dishwasher, her back to us. The hum of it filled the space between us until it felt heavy. Martin had warned me this part would be awkward. You took back control, he said, and that upsets the order they've been enjoying. Expect a chill. The chill came all right. Over the next few days, Claire's words to me were functional at best. Dinners at 6, or meals on the counter. And her conversations with David seemed to move into whispered tones when I entered the room. But there was something else beneath her coolness, a quiet scramble. I noticed her on the phone more often, her voice low but urgent, paperwork spread across the dining table. One afternoon, I passed by and caught sight of a mortgage calculator open on her laptop. She slammed it shut when she saw me. I didn't comment. The valuation report arrived in the mail at the end of the week. I signed for it myself, thanked the courier, and took it straight to my suite. The property's worth had gone up considerably. Good news for my trust, not so good for anyone hoping to wrestle a piece of it away. Later that day, as I was watering the hydrangeas out front, I heard the screen door creak open. Claire stepped onto the porch. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice tight but careful. I straightened, the hose still running gently over the soil. "Of course." She hesitated, eyes on the flowers. "I don't think you understand what you've done. This trust thing, it puts David and me in a really difficult spot." I met her gaze, calm. "Claire, what I've done is make sure my share of this home is safe. That's all." "It's more than that," she said quickly. She stopped, as if realizing her tone was slipping. "It's not how families should operate." I turned off the hose, letting the water settle into the earth. "You're right," I said softly. "Families should operate with respect, and when that respect disappears, people protect themselves." For a moment, she looked like she might argue. Then she pressed her lips together and went back inside. That weekend, David knocked on my door. He had the look of a man carrying too much on his shoulders. "She's upset," he said. "I imagine she is. She says you blindsided her, that you've been planning this." "I didn't plan for it to be this way," I said, setting my book aside. "But I had to respond to how I've been treated." He sat in the chair by my desk, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't want to be in the middle of this, Mom." I nodded. "I'm not asking you to take sides, David. I'm asking you to understand that this is about my home and my dignity." He didn't speak for a while, just looked down at the carpet. Finally, he said, "Evan's lucky to have you thinking about his future." That was all, but it was enough. Word got around faster than I expected. At the next HOA meeting, I noticed a few curious glances in my direction, as if people had picked up bits of the story. June from next door stopped by the following morning with a pie. "Good for you," she said, handing it over. "It's about time folks remembered whose name is on the dotted line." I smiled. "It's not about winning, June. It's about setting things right." Still, I could feel the shift in the way people spoke to me. Less of the, "How long are you staying?" and more of the, "How's your garden coming along?" It was as if reclaiming my place in the house had somehow restored my place in the neighborhood. Claire, though, was another matter. One afternoon, she had her social club over again. I was in my suite with the door open reading when I heard her voice float down the hall. "Well, she's got her papers and her trust, so there's no point in discussing changes anymore." There was a murmur of sympathy from one of the women, followed by a change of subject. It was subtle, but I could hear it. The shift from control to containment. She could no longer move the pieces on the board the way she wanted. A few days later, I found a stack of my mail on the counter, unopened. That alone was enough to tell me something had changed. That evening, I made dinner. Nothing elaborate, just roast chicken with herbs from my garden and warm rolls. I set the table for 3. When David and Claire came in, they looked surprised. "I thought we could have dinner together," I said, and sat at the head of the table. We ate mostly in silence, but it wasn't tense, just quiet. Halfway through, David asked about the hydrangeas, and I told him they were thriving. Claire didn't say much, but she passed me the salad without me asking. When the plates were cleared, I went to my suite and came back with a single envelope. I placed it on the table in front of Claire. She looked at it warily. "What is this?" "It's a copy of the trust documents," I said, "so you know exactly what they say." Her eyes flicked up to mine. "Why are you giving me this?" "Because there's no reason for secrets anymore. Everything's in writing. You don't have to guess, and you don't have to make up your own version." She opened the envelope, glanced at the first page, and set it back down. "You didn't have to—" "I did," I interrupted gently. "If we're going to live under the same roof, I want things to be clear, that's all." She nodded once, her face unreadable. I stood, collected my plate, and carried it to the sink. My hands were steady, my chest light. Because this wasn't a surrender and it wasn't a victory lap. It was a line drawn in ink. And then the simple act of stepping back, letting the paper speak for itself. As I rinsed my plate, I glanced out the window toward the garden. The hydrangeas were catching the last blush of the setting sun, each bloom a soft globe of color against the darkening green. I dried my hands, walked out to the porch, and sat with my tea, feeling the evening settle around me. Behind me, the house was quiet. Ahead, the sky was open. The days after that dinner unfolded quietly, the way early spring shifts towards summer without anyone marking the exact moment. Claire and I exchanged the usual courtesies, and while the warmth between us didn't return, the constant undercurrent of tension eased. The trust documents sat in her desk drawer now. I knew because I saw her slide them in one afternoon. She hadn't brought them up again. That was fine. I hadn't given them to her to spark a conversation. I'd given them to close one. David still kept to his work and weekend projects, but every so often he'd linger by my garden and ask about the flowers, or sit with me on the porch in the evenings. We didn't revisit the argument. We didn't need to. One Tuesday morning, I got a call from the director of the independent living community across town. A place with a sunny library, a garden terrace, and yes, hydrangeas lining the path to the front door. They had an opening in one of their corner apartments. I toured it that Friday. The rooms were bright and breezy, the kind of space that makes you stand a little taller when you walk through. The kitchen was just big enough for one person to cook without bumping elbows, and the balcony looked out over the koi pond. By the time I left, I knew. I moved in 2 weeks later. It wasn't a dramatic departure. No slammed doors, no shouting. I packed my books, my desk, the quilt from my grandmother. I told David and Claire the date, and they nodded. On my last morning in the house, I made tea and stood by the kitchen window, watching the sunlight spill over the backyard. The hydrangeas swayed in the breeze, their petals brushing against each other like they were sharing a secret. Claire came in as I was rinsing my cup. "Well," she said, "I suppose this will be different." "Yes," I replied and offered her a small smile. "Different can be good." She didn't answer, just turned to the sink and started washing a pan. David carried my last box out to the car. We hugged, a little stiffly but sincerely. And I could tell there were things neither of us knew how to say. That was all right. Sometimes leaving words unsaid is its own kind of peace. The first night in my new place, I unpacked slowly, setting each item exactly where I wanted it. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and lemon cleaner, and through the open balcony door I could hear the soft trickle of water from the pond. I made a cup of chamomile tea and carried it outside. The evening air was cool, and the last light of the day turned the surface of the pond into a sheet of gold. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely alone in the best way, not isolated, not overlooked, just my own. Life settled into a new rhythm. Mornings with tea and the paper on the balcony, afternoons tending to the community garden or reading in the library, evenings walking the winding paths around the pond, watching the koi move lazily under the surface. I stayed in touch with David. He called more often now, without Claire in the background, and sometimes he came by on his own. We didn't dwell on what had happened. Instead, we talked about books, about Evan, about the weather. Those were safe bridges to keep between us. As for Claire, I never heard her voice again. Looking back, I can see it all with a kind of clarity that only comes when you've stepped out of the storm. For a while, I'd believed that enduring quietly was the same as keeping peace. But silence can be a wall, or it can be a door, and the difference is whether you have the key. I learned that boundaries aren't unkind. They're what make kindness possible, without losing yourself in the process. And I learned something else, too. Family isn't defined by who shares your roof, but by who respects your place beneath it. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I sat on the bench by the koi pond with a neighbor I'd grown fond of. We were watching the fish glide just under the surface, the air warm and still. She asked me if I missed my old home. I thought about the walls I'd helped pay for, the garden I'd tended, the rooms I'd once called mine. I thought about the mornings I'd woken there feeling like an intruder. And I said, no. I took the part of it that mattered with me, the part that had my name on it. She smiled, and we sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned to amber. That night, I wrote a single line in my journal before bed, the kind of line you don't have to explain to anyone who's lived enough to understand. Some doors you close for good, not to shut someone out, but to keep yourself in. And for the first time in a long time, I slept without locking mine.